These were the most dangerous cults in human history. Number 5. The Manson family. Manson family was one of the most deadliest cults in human history. Charles Manson was the leader. Charles Manson wasn't some big, scary figure. He was this wiry, manipulative guy with a guitar and a dream of becoming a rock star. Born in 1934, Manson spent most of his life bouncing between prisons. But when he hit California in the 1960s, he reinvented himself as a spiritual guru. He had this way of pulling people in, especially young women. He preached about love, freedom, and a new way of life. But spoiler alert, behind all the peace and love talk, he was harboring some seriously twisted ideas. The Manson family wasn't an actual family. It was a group of young people, mostly women, who followed Manson like he was a god. They lived in this commune-style setup, squatting at places like the Spawn Ranch, an old movie set. Manson controlled them through drugs, manipulation, and fear. He convinced them the world was on the brink of a race war he called Helter Skelter, a name he stole from a Beatles song. He claimed he was the chosen one to guide humanity through the chaos. Now this is where things go from weird cult to true horror story. In 1969, Manson decided it was time to force Helter Skelter into action. And that's when the murders began. August 9th, 1969. Manson ordered his followers to go to the home of actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. His followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkle, and Linda Kasabian, broke in and murdered everyone inside. Sharon begged for her baby's life, but they killed her in a brutal, senseless way. They also killed her friends and left messages like "pig" scrawled in blood on the walls. The next night, the family struck again. This time, they targeted Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their own home. The murders were just as violent, and again they left creepy messages written in blood. The goal? To frame black activists for the crimes and ignite the race war Manson predicted. It's as insane as it sounds. Manson thought he was untouchable, but the police eventually connected the dots. During the trial, Manson and his followers acted bizarre. Manson carved a swastika into his forehead. His followers stood by him, even taking the blame for the murders. In 1971, Manson and several followers were sentenced to life in prison. Manson himself became this twisted symbol of evil. He died in 2017, but his legacy still sends chills down our spines. Number 4. Shinrikyo. It's the 1980s in Japan, and this guy named Shoko Asahara, a partially blind yoga instructor, claims he's not just a guru, but the next Buddha. Oh, and also Jesus Christ. He starts Shinrikyo, a cult mixing Buddhism, Hinduism, and his own crazy ideas. It starts as a spiritual group, promising enlightenment and salvation. But as more people joined, including scientists and engineers, Asahara's teachings got darker. He predicted a nuclear apocalypse and said only his followers would survive. Shinrikyo wasn't your typical chanting in robes cult. They were highly organized and tech-savvy. They built secret labs, made weapons, and even tried to develop nuclear bombs. Yeah, they weren't messing around. They also made mind control part of the program, using fear, isolation, and physical abuse to keep members loyal. People who tried to leave, they vanished. By the mid-90s, Asahara decided it was time to speed up the apocalypse. Why wait for the end of the world when you can start it yourself? In 1995, they carried out one of the most horrifying attacks in modern history, the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. Members of the cult released a deadly nerve agent, sarin, during rush hour, targeting thousands of innocent commuters. The result? 13 dead, over 6,000 injured, and an entire city gripped with fear. People collapsed in train stations, blinded and gasping for air. It was chaos. The attack was a wake-up call. Police raided Shinrikyo's compounds and discovered stockpiles of chemical weapons, more sarin gas, and detailed plans for future attacks. Asahara and several high-ranking members were arrested, and he was eventually executed in 2018. But here's the creepy part. Shinrikyo never fully disappeared. It rebranded as Aleph and still has followers today. Number 3. Children of God. It all started in the late 1960s with a guy named David Berg, also known as Moses David. He claimed to be a prophet of God, and his message? A mix of doomsday prophecies, free love, and rejecting mainstream society. At first, it seemed like just another hippie commune. Berg attracted young, disillusioned people who wanted an alternative lifestyle. But under the surface, this was no peace and love movement. It was a full-blown cult with some seriously dark practices. Berg demanded total devotion and had absolute control over his followers' lives. He made his own rules, which included isolating members from their families, taking all their money, and, worst of all, promoting sexual exploitation as a form of spiritual love. Yeah, it's as horrifying as it sounds. Berg even wrote disturbing letters called the Mo letters, where he laid out his twisted theology. Okay, this is where things get really messed up. Berg introduced something called flirty fishing, where female members were encouraged to seduce men to bring them into the cult or get donations. He literally turned his followers into tools for recruitment and financial gain. It wasn't just manipulation, it was abuse on a massive scale. Here's a wild twist. Some famous people were actually raised in the Children of God. Actors like Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan grew up in the cult, but later escaped and spoke out against it. They've shared how traumatic it was to grow up in such a controlled and toxic environment. By the 1980s, authorities started catching on. Survivors spoke out, exposing the cult's abusive practices, including the exploitation of children. Lawsuits piled up, and the group was forced to go underground. Today, the cult still exists under the name the Family International, but it claims to have reformed. Number 2. Heaven's Gate. It's the 1970s, and two people, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, decide they're the chosen ones. Applewhite thought he was basically an alien in a human body, and Nettles was his spiritual partner sent to guide him. Together, they formed Heaven's Gate, a cult that combined Christianity, sci-fi, and some seriously out there ideas. Their pitch, if you followed them, you'd ascend to a higher evolutionary level and live eternally on a spaceship. Sound crazy? It gets crazier. Members of Heaven's Gate had to completely give up their earthly lives. They ditched their families, shaved their heads, wore identical clothes, and even went by new, alien-inspired names. Oh, and they weren't allowed to have sex, drink, or do anything that made them feel human. Applewhite told them they had to shed their earthly attachments to prepare for their big journey. He controlled every aspect of their lives, convincing them that obedience was the key to boarding the UFO. Fast forward to the 1990s, and here comes the Hale-Bopp comet, a bright, beautiful comet streaking across the sky. For most people, it was just a cool astronomical event. For Heaven's Gate, it was the sign they'd been waiting for. Applewhite claimed there was a spaceship hiding behind the comet, ready to take them to their next life. But there was a catch. To get on board, they had to exit their human vessels. Translation: commit suicide. In March 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate carried out one of the most chilling mass suicides in history. They dressed in identical black outfits with Nike sneakers, covered themselves in purple shrouds, and drank a lethal cocktail of vodka and phenobarbital. When authorities found them in their California mansion, it was like something out of a horror movie. Bodies neatly arranged in bunk beds, and one of the body was the leader's. With this death, the story of Heaven's Gate ended. Number 1. The People's Temple. It's the 1950s, and this charismatic guy named Jim Jones shows up preaching about equality, love, and building a utopia where everyone belongs. Sounds good, right? People from all walks of life were drawn to him, especially those marginalized by society. But there was something off about him from the start. He was power-hungry, manipulative, and obsessed with control. By the 1970s, Jim had thousands of followers. His church, the People's Temple, wasn't just a church, it was a movement. But behind the scenes, it was a straight-up cult, complete with brainwashing, financial exploitation, and abuse. Here's where it gets sinister. Jim convinced his followers to leave everything behind and move to Jonestown, a so-called paradise in the middle of the Guyanese jungle. Why? To escape the corruption of America. But when they got there, it wasn't paradise, it was a nightmare. People were forced to work long hours, food was scarce, and Jones? He ruled with an iron fist. He even used loudspeakers to broadcast his sermons 24/7, so there was no escape from his voice. In 1978, concerned family members and politicians started investigating the cult. Congressman Leo Ryan actually flew down to Jonestown to check things out. At first, things seemed fine, but then some members tried to escape with Ryan's group. Jones's followers attacked them at the airstrip, killing Ryan, 3 journalists, and a defector. This was the point of no return. After the airstrip attack, Jones ordered his followers to commit mass suicide. He called it revolutionary suicide, claiming it was a protest against oppression. Over 900 people, including 304 children, drank a cyanide-laced punch. Those who resisted? They were forced at gunpoint. The aftermath was horrifying. Rows and rows of bodies lying face down in the jungle. It's one of the largest mass deaths in modern history. That's all, guys. Please like and subscribe, and always remember, if it breathes, it breeds.